These three mistakes could be costing you a ton of money in 3-bet pots. Almost everyone is making them, and even high-stakes players are often guilty of the last one. So make sure you watch till the end for a quick and easy way to boost your win rate. Betting too small on low boards. So when you look at a board like 7-5 deuce rainbow, it looks pretty dry, and also given that you're in position with a low SPR, it's pretty tempting to be using a small size, right? A big size might not feel especially effective on such a dry board, but it turns out that if you look at what the solver wants to do in this kind of situation, it actually wants to bet pretty big. So somewhere around like 2/3 to 3/4 pot is turns out it's the optimal size on the board like 7-5 deuce rainbow. And the main reason for this is that our range is actually pretty polarized on this board, right? Unlike in a single raise pot, we're not really going to have hands like 7x, 5x, probably not going to have pocket pairs like 3s and 4s, or at least hopefully not, right? And because of that, our bet size is really driven by our overpair region. So let's take a look at an example of this. So this over here is button 3-bet versus cutoff, right? So cutoff open, button 3-bets and cutoff calls, and we get this 7-5 deuce rainbow board. And you can see the preferred size that the solver likes is actually 3/4 pot. And when you look at the composition of button's range, it's actually pretty clear why we want to size up, because besides overpairs, button actually just has a bunch of high cards like ace high as well as king high. There's really no in-between hands like top pairs, under pairs, second pairs. So its range is pretty polarized. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, how big do overpairs want to bet? So overpairs, being pretty strong, of course, they're going to want to be sizing up, right? They have like plenty enough equity, right? Aces, kings, they have in excess of 80% equity. So there's no need to be making the small, like 1/3 pot size bet that's usually reserved for hands that have around maybe 60 or 60 something percent equity that are not able to bet such a big size because they're just going to isolate themselves against stronger hands. But aces and kings, clearly it's not going to have this sort of problem, right? You can see the effect of a big bet like 3/4 pot, right, is that we're still able to get plenty of value against hands that are way behind us, right? This entire region of 1-pair hands, right? Stuff like weak overpairs as well. It's a pretty good result to be, if you bet a hand like aces or kings, you get called by like 10s, right? This hand is basically drawing dead against you. So of course you want to win as big of a bet as possible against hands like these. Even stuff like ace 5, 6, 7, right? They only have 5 outs against you. So that's the benefit of sizing up, right? You definitely get to extract more value from this part of your opponent's range, right? And you'll see that this also applies to low pair boards, right? Actually, doesn't really matter that much whether the board is paired or unpaired. The shape of our range, the shape of our opponent's range is pretty similar, right? No matter whether the board is 7-5 deuce or like 7-5-5, for example, you're always going to see that our range is pretty much like overpairs and overcards, right? And as we've discussed before, the overpairs mostly want to go big. So 7-5-5, we're betting around mostly half pot, right? So not quite as big as before, but we definitely don't want to go like 1/3 of the pot, right? Again, looking at the composition of our range, it is pretty similar, right? We just have a bunch of overpairs and a bunch of bluffs, right? And the natural bet size for all of these overpairs is a slightly bigger one. Okay, so the question then is, why do you guys think that in the single raise pot on the board like 5-5-3, we clearly want to be going for a smaller size, right? Again, this is something that we can take a look at later with the GTO Wizard reports, right? But pair boards in general, we want to be sizing down, right? So why do you guys think this doesn't apply for 3-bet pots? The caller probably has like a similar amount of nut hands, right? It's probably going to be around like 5 or 6%, right? That 5 or 6% actually matters much more when the SPR is high. Right? Paris says ranges are wider, which is really true as well. Right? Because ranges are wider, what we actually see, right, is that big blind is of course calling way wider since this is a single raise pot and he's getting like a good discount in the big blind. Right? So the result is that if button has a hand like ace king, so first of all, you can kind of see our range is not quite as polarized. Right? It's not just like very strong hands and air hands, right? There's quite a bit of like top pair as well. Right? Stuff like small pocket pairs, like slightly higher proportion of these hands, and of course most of these hands don't want to bet quite as big. Right? And on top of that, something really important to understand here is that when you have a hand like ace king or ace queen, right, this actually falls into the category of a marginal hand. Right? Previously in the 3-bet pot, it was more of a bluff because it's quite it's not that realistic to be betting like 3/4 pot with ace king, or not that realistic to be betting like any size with ace king and to expect to have like really good equity when called. Right? But in a single raise pot, right, especially if we bet small enough, we can get called by plenty of worse ace high. Right? Opponent is calling with pretty much every ace high, quite a bit of king queen and king jack as well, and this allows us to get quite a bit of thin value. And of course, we're only able to get this thin value if we use a small enough size. Right? Imagine if we start potting it with a hand like ace king, we're going to be folding out quite a lot of the hands that we would much rather get called by. Right? So the point is that if we want to bet a hand like ace king, then the only size that makes sense to bet is the small one. So this has the effect of driving our bet sizing downwards. Right? The overpairs themselves would probably want to bet a bigger size on their own, but because we're also pretty interested in betting hands like ace king as well as some of these smaller pocket pairs that need quite a bit of protection. Right? If you bet a hand like fours, and your opponent folds something like queen jack, right? You're basically folding out 9 outs worth of equity because he can hit a queen, a jack, as well as a 7. Right? And it's all of these marginal hands that are driving our bet sizing downwards because once again, the only way that we can bet them is to use a small bet size. So this is reflected in the equity of a hand like ace king as well, right? 63% in a single raise pot. And if we go back to the previous 3-bet pot, you can see that ace king only has barely like less than 50%. So clearly, if you bet like a third of the pot, your opponent calls, your equity is going to drop like way below 50%. Right? So this hand actually doesn't really affect our bet size in any way. It's pretty much a bluff at this point. So with bluffs, their sizing just tends to follow whatever your strong hands want to go for, which of course is the big size. So quiz question number 1. On the board of 7-5 deuce rainbow, we saw that the solver mostly wants to bet 3/4 pot. How do you guys think the sizing is going to change if the board was two-tone and sick? A, should we size down since our overpairs have a little bit less equity? B, maybe we should size up to charge our opponent's flush draws? Or C, do you expect there to be not much of a change? Turns out the correct answer is actually A, right? To size down. And the reason why we size down is just because your overpairs are worth a slightly smaller bet, right? So well done to everyone who got it correct. Let's take a look at some of these two-tone boards, right? Basically, let's say if we change this to the deuce of diamond, right? Immediately you're going to see the bet sizing shift downwards. We're barely, pretty much never using the 3/4 pot now. We're only going for the half pot bet. Right? And let's also take a look at some of these reports. So let's filter low disconnected boards. Right? Let's say 8 high and below. Right? And if we filter by bet size, right, what you see is that the pretty much only boards where the big bet is getting used, they're all exclusively rainbow boards. Right? And then most of the two-tone boards were betting half pot, sometimes even a little bit smaller than that. Right? And the main reason is that your overpairs are just worth a slightly smaller size. Right? If the board was 7-5 deuce rainbow, what we saw previously was that there's not much of an issue in sizing up, right? Because even if you bet like pretty big, your opponent still has to call with a ton of very weak bluff catchers, right? Even hands like 8s and 9s, they don't look weak, but I would still consider them weak bluff catchers because the times that they're behind, they're only drawing to 2 outs. Right? So it's really nice that you can put in such a big bet and still get called by plenty of these hands. Right? And of course, getting called by 7x and 5x is not bad as well, right? It's not quite as good, but it's definitely not a bad thing. Right? On the other hand, if you change this to the deuce of diamonds, right? And now let's say we try betting 3/4 spot, right? Immediately you see, you can kind of see why this size is not that efficient, because you lose quite a bit of value from all of these like weak pocket pair bluff catchers, right? Again, 8s and 9s, right? You really need to get called by these hands, right? Ideally, you want to get called by as many of them as possible because they're only drawing to 2 outs against your value region, right? And the main reason why these hands don't need to depend, I guess there's 2 different ways of looking at it, right? Probably a more accurate way of thinking about it is to say that these hands are now devalued given the presence of the flush draw, right? When the board is two-tone, every single one pair hand is going to go down in equity. So if you're betting the same size, your opponent's getting the same pot odds, but his equity is lower, naturally he's going to be more inclined to fold, right? Because something like 9s, now your bluffs are going to have so many more outs, right? You're going to have stuff like king, queen of diamonds, king, jack of diamonds, and 9s is basically flipping with those hands at this point. So that's one way of looking at it, right? Or you can also say that we don't need to defend so many of these weakest bluff catchers because we have plenty of better candidates to defend, right? So stuff like king, queen of diamonds, basically all of these flush draws that have so many outs, even the times that they are behind, right? They're doing much better equity-wise against your overpairs, right? So we tend to prefer calling with these hands instead of pocket pairs. And if we were to call like pocket pairs on top of our flush draws, would probably be calling a little bit too much, right? And ultimately, the effect that this has on Button's bet size, right, is that it just makes it a lot less attractive to be going for such a big size because you're now taking away a lot of the weakest bluff catchers in your opponent's calling range, and you're replacing them with hands that have a ton of outs against your value region. Imagine if you have a hand like queens or jacks, right, and instead of calling with pocket fours, your opponent is now calling with hands like ace 10 of diamonds, right? That's quite a disaster for your specific hand because this hand is essentially flipping with you, right? So to solve this problem, what we do is we just size down a touch. If we bet half pot instead, then a lot of these weak bluff catchers are going to start calling again, right? And that's more or less the reason why we sized out, right? Just to make sure that our overpairs have a little bit better equity when call, and they're not just isolating themselves against all of these high equity hands in your opponent's range. So I'm going to draw a diagram now, right? Just to further illustrate this point. Right? So imagine if we have a hand like queens, right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up all of our opponent's various holdings, right? And I'm going to plot the graph of how much equity queens has against every single hand in the caller's range. So I'm going to start off with the rainbow board. So on the rainbow board, your opponent is going to have some sets for sure, right? It's not that big of a proportion, but you're gonna be drawing in like some percentage of the time, right, against like 7s and 5s. So this represents like the very strong hands in your opponent's range. But besides that, you can imagine there's not really that many hands that you're worried about, right? Most of your opponent's bluff catchers, they're gonna have like at most like 5 outs against you, right? And then a lot of them are just going to only have 2 outs as well, right? So the graph, pardon the drawing, right? But the graph of like the amount of equity that queens has, if you plot it according to every single hand in your opponent's range, right, it's going to look something like this, right? And that's exactly the reason why we were able to bet such a big size, right? Because let's say if we as we increase our bet size, we bet bigger and bigger and bigger, our opponent is going to call a tighter range for sure, right? At some point, we don't want to go so big that we just isolate us against all of the very strong hands, right? But we can still bet pretty big and have really decent equity by call, right? Even when we reach this point, you can see as a whole, like on average, right, we're still getting a lot of very thick value from our opponent's bluff catchers. Right? So that's the reason why we're okay with sizing up these low rainbow boards. Okay, on the other hand, so I'm also going to plot the graph of, let's say if the board was two-tone instead. Right? So similarly, queens is going to, or rather your opponent is also going to have some region of hands that are in really good shape against you. Right? So this again would be like hands like sets and maybe some two pair on certain boards. But besides that, right, there's also going to be a bunch of like flush draws, right, that have a significant amount of outs against you and a significant amount of equity against your overpairs, right? And of course, you're still going to have like a bunch of 5-outers and 2-outers. So the overall effect, right, you can see that if we start going for too large of a bet, okay, so as this bar starts shifting towards the left, right? Previously on the rainbow board, so if you look at the blue line, this is still like pretty okay, right? Because we're getting like really thick value from all of our opponents' weakest bluff catchers. Right? But if you do this on a two-tone board, then at some point the equity of your overpair, the times that you get called, is going to be quite poor, right? Because you're basically like forcing out all of the hands that have fewer outs against you, and then you're getting called by hands that you're basically flipping against. So to solve this problem, right, what we do is we go for a more of an intermediate size, right? Not too small, but not too big as well. So if you bet like half pot, right, you can still get called by a bunch of hands that like don't have that many outs against you. So it's kind of like a healthy medium, right? You're not losing too much value, but you're also not just like isolating yourself against all of the high equity hands. So this brings us to the second mistake, right? Mistake number 2. Betting weaker overpairs too often. So this is something that I'm sure we all do a lot in single raise spots, right? Like button versus big blind, especially. It's really natural, on the low board to just bet hands like nines and tens, right? And then if you want to use some overpairs to protect your checking range, it's again really natural to use hands like aces and perhaps kings. But turns out that this is a pretty big mistake in 3-bet pots. Like, of course, the reason why we do this in single raise pots is because the lower overpairs are more vulnerable. Right? So again, in a single raise pot, if you look at buttons, what buttons overpairs are doing, right? We're definitely betting like eights and nines more often than aces and kings, right? But you need to understand that the reason why we're allowed to do this is that the big blind is not really going to have that many hands in between aces and eights, right? It has like a little bit of nines, but that's about it. So aces and eights are pretty much the same hand. Right, I guess aces has a little bit more equity, right? Because your hand is not as vulnerable. But in terms of the proportion of your opponent's range that you're behind, right? They're pretty much behind like the same percentage of your opponent's range. So naturally, if our hand is worth about the same strength, of course we prefer to bet the one that's more vulnerable, right? But it's a little bit dangerous to apply this to a 3-bet pot, right? Especially in position 3-bet pot where ranges are so tight, and as you go earlier and earlier in the position. So let's take a look at cutoff versus cutoff 3-bet versus hijack. And already you start to see a trend where aces and kings are betting way more often than stuff like eights and nines, right? And the reason for that is because the hijack is going to have plenty of jacks and tens and nines. So when you compare a hand like aces with eights, they're really not the same hand at all, right? And this is reflected in the equity difference. Aces, 84% equity. Eights, 59% equity, right? So it's more or less a marginal hand at this point. And if you look at the frequency of the various overpairs, I think this makes a lot of sense as well, right? Like queens and jacks, betting all the time, queens especially, right? It makes sense to bet all the time because it's somewhat vulnerable, and there's not much of a difference between aces and queens, right? Since your opponent is not going to have these hands very often, right? So that's why like queens, you can see is betting just a tiny bit more than aces. But once you go down to tens and nines and eights, there's too big of an equity difference, right? Like there's too big of a drop in equity, because not only does your opponent have a bunch of jacks and tens, right? Jacks and tens are also quite a large proportion of your opponent's range, given how tight he's calling, right? So even though the absolute number of combos is not big, But, ultimately, big blind is only, the caller is only going to have like 63 combos total, right? So it makes a huge difference whether you have aces or nines in this case. And the effect only gets more and more extreme as we go earlier and earlier in the positions. So let's say hijack 3-bet versus UTG. Right, again, you see the same trend, right? I think it's just a little bit more extreme, right? Tens is actually quite a high frequency check now. 8s and 9s, interestingly, the types that you bet these hands, right? They actually have a little bit of bluff element to them, right? Because your opponent is supposed to fold like 10s and 9s sometimes, right? So you can really understand like why aces and kings are betting way more often than the weaker overpairs. So the next question is, how can we exploit someone who's making this mistake? Let's say if your opponent in a situation like this is, is playing it a little bit more like a single raise pot, betting hands like nines and tens and jacks, and then checking hands like aces and kings. Right? What kinds of adjustments do you think we can make against his c-bet? I would say the main adjustment, right, is really to be a bit more aggressive with hands like queens and jacks specifically. Right? If a hand like queens is originally indifferent to check raising and check calling, it's indifferent given the fact that your opponent is betting aces and kings a lot, right? And then not betting jacks and tens that often. Right? So if someone's doing the opposite, right, then surely queens is going to become much higher EV as a check raise now, right? So if this hand was previously indifferent to both options, I would imagine, right, against an opponent who is like betting jacks and tens and checking aces and kings, right, queens should just become like a pure check raise now. So that would be the main adjustment that I would make if I suspected that my opponent was making this mistake. And in a way, it actually makes it even more important as the 3-better to be betting hands like aces and kings, right? Because in my own experience as a live player, so I played a lot of soft games, right? People really like to check raise hands like queens and jacks. I guess their thought process is something like, if I have queens and I run into aces or kings, right, I'm just going to get stacked anyway. So I might as well just get the money now, right, protect my hand against ace king. Right? So if I had to guess, that's probably why they really like to check raise this type of hand. So can you imagine if you now make the mistake of like betting nines and tens and then checking aces and kings? Even though technically against a static GTO opponent, right, it's not really a serious error, right? Since ultimately aces is indifferent to bet and check, right? Tens and nines are indifferent to betting and checking. But against, specifically against an opponent who's check raising queens and jacks all the time, he's actually going to unconsciously be exploiting you, right? He might not be trying to exploit any specific mistake in your game, or he might not have the right reasons to check raise a hand like queens, but he's still going to be exploiting you at the end of the day, right? Because ultimately you're making this mistake that makes the EV of raising with queens much higher than before, right? So I think in practice especially, it's pretty important to get this right, especially for hands like kings that are basically pure bets. I think there's even some EV difference between like betting and checking. Doesn't seem like it's huge, right? But with this kind of hand, usually you don't want to be like checking it too much, right? Because if you're up against a good opponent and your opponent sees you check a hand like aces or kings, he can be pretty sure that you're making this mistake, and then you should be able to come up with the appropriate adjustments as well. Yep. So even more important to bet hands like aces, to prioritize hands like aces over the weaker overpairs in practice. Quiz question number 2. How should we adjust our probing strategy against someone who is betting all of their overpairs on the flop, right? So not just the weaker overpairs, right? They're actually betting the weaker overpairs as well as the stronger overpairs. So option number 1, bluff all of our air, right? And option number 2, bet bigger and more often with one pair hands. And of course, I'm referring to the turn or after the flop goes check. If the turn is the low card, right? What kinds of adjustments should we make? So I'm going to pull up the poll. I'm pretty sure many of you guys would choose like both options if you could, right? But the point is to choose the one that you think is the most correct. It turns out the most precise answer would be B, right? To bet bigger and more often with one pair hands. So let me justify my answer, right? Why is it not technically correct to just be bluffing all of your air. So let me pull up like an example of the situation, or let's say if the flop is like 9-7-3, right? This is hijack versus a cutoff 3-bet. Right? If the flop goes check, and again, the assumption is that your opponent is not checking enough of these overpairs. Right? If you look at the composition of his checking range, it needs to have like about 17% overpair, which is quite a big percentage. Right? So let's say if he completely lacks all of these overpairs. Right? If we were to play a strategy where we overbluff on the turn, right, with the idea that our opponent, is kind of capped at ace high and he cannot really be calling us that often, right? That's a little bit of a logical leap in a way, right? Just because your opponent is capped doesn't necessarily mean that he's overfolding. Right? Imagine if you bluff all of your air for a small size or the same sizes that the solver is using, right? Mostly betting like 20-30% pot. Right? Even if your opponent doesn't have overpairs to defend with, right, it's still gonna have plenty of hands like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, right? And it's actually really easy to imagine an opponent who's calling too much in this scenario, right? On the board of 9-7-3-3, especially, the turn is really good for your opponent's ace highs, where they now have like a little bit more showdown value than before. Someone might even reason that the board being double two-tone, you're gonna have like plenty of bluffs, right? So people might start to get a little bit stickier with hands like ace king and ace queen, right? And now it's going to kind of backfire, right? You just bluff like everything for a small size in a situation where your opponent is potentially calling too much. Yeah, now it turns out that we are the ones who are getting exploited. So instead of just bluffing all of your air, a much better adjustment is to first of all understand that all of these one pair hands in our range, right? Top pair, under pair, second pair, they're going to have much more equity than before. The reason why a hand like H only has 64% equity is because of this 17% of overpairs in your opponent's checking range. Right? Once you take that away, right, H is going to be pretty close to the nuts. Right? And hands that have more equity, they simply just want to bet bigger. I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Knowing that your opponent is capped at ace king, right? You might imagine that, these hands should go smaller, to try and induce a call from ace king, right? But that's not quite the way that it works in theory, right? If we think our hand is strong enough to bet big, then we just bet big, right? It doesn't matter if ace king is calling or folding, because even if, let's say we bet 3/4 pot, right? And in a situation where our opponent doesn't have any overpairs, for sure he needs to defend with more ace king, right? But let's say if he's not willing to do that, he's not willing to call with ace king, ace queen, right? He would just like quite literally be folding, well, not quite everything. I guess he's going to have stuff like flush draws, right? It's going to be massively overfolding, right? And then now our bluffs are going to go up in EV, because for sure we're going to have plenty of bluffs that are also going to size up along with our value, right? And that's a much better adjustment than just bluffing all of your air for the same size that the solver was using previously. So it's kind of a catch-22 situation for your opponent, right? As long as you are betting like quite big with your one pair hands, you're mixing in the appropriate amount of bluffs, it doesn't actually matter whether he calls with his ace king or he folds with his ace king. If he wants to call, then of course you're pretty happy in the sense that he's paying off all of your value hands, right? Even a hand like 7x or pocket sixes, right? You can get quite a bit of value if your opponent will call ace king, ace queen versus like a 3/4 pot size bet. If he wants to fold these hands, then that's fine as well, right? Obviously your one pair hands are going to get less value, but that's going to be more than compensated for by all of these bluffs that are just going to go up in EV. Okay, last common mistake, right? Not turning enough one pair into a bluff. So in position 3-bets, like I mentioned previously, they're really strong, they're really linear, right? And imagine if the board is like ace high or king high especially, right? We're going to absolutely smash the board. And even if we make a really small bet, very often what you see is on like a double Broadway board, right, out of position, just folding like every single mid-pocket pair versus a 20% bet or something ridiculous like that. And it's really just because our range is way too strong. It connects way too well with the board, right? So as a result of this, right, if you imagine in the lines where out of position check calls the flop, right? From the three better's perspective, a lot of his one pair hands are actually not going to have that much showdown value, right? So let's take a look at an example of this. This ace 10 high board, for example, right? Hijack 3-bet versus under the gun. So hijack, he's betting something like 20% pot on the flop, right? On the board, on the flop of ace 10 deuce. Right? And look at UTG's defending range, right? He cannot even call, hence like 9s and 8s and 7s, right? Versus such a tiny bet, even like jacks is folding most of the time, right? And one of the results of this is that when you go to the turn, right, from the hijack's perspective, from the three better's perspective, a hand like 10x is actually not going to have that much showdown value. Right? I don't think it's a hand that has that much, sorry, did I say ace 10? I meant like king 10, like most of your middle pair hands. King 10 without the flush draw is only going to have 31% equity. So it looks like a marginal hand, looks like it has a little bit of showdown value, but actually it's just as good as like any other bluff in your range, right? And as a result, right, this is one of the reasons why these hands are getting bluffed so often, right? It's not even like a low frequency thing. King 10 is actually pretty close to a pure bet, right? With or without the flush draw. In fact, it seems like without the flush draw, we are even more inclined to go for the turn bet. I think this is happening because we don't block like some of the hands that we're trying to get value from, because our opponent probably still has to call hands like Jack 10 of hearts, right? So we don't really want to have the heart, right? Since we get a little bit less value from hands like Jack 10 as well as 10-9. Okay, but that's not the main point, right? The main point is just that to understand that a lot of these one pair hands, whether it's second pair, whether it's some of the lower pocket pairs, they actually don't have a lot of showdown value. So there's no reason like why we shouldn't be turning them into a bluff. Right? And what I've noticed is also that especially when there's a big gap between the ace and the 10, there's even more reason to be bluffing with hands like king 10, right? Because when you look at your opponent's response, right, there's actually this region of like queens and jacks, right, that you can target with a bet. You know, these hands are pretty much always folding the turn, right? So in a way, when you bet something like king 10, it's almost like a value bluff where you're folding queens and jacks for sure. You're folding out even some of the weaker ace-x, right? And then at the same time, you can even get little bit of value, right, from some of the worst 10x in your opponent's range, right? So it's not like a lot of value. I think just that's because our bet is a little bit bigger, right? But there are like some situations where we're betting a little bit smaller, right? For 3/4 pot, again, you see the same kind of trend, right? Where we're pure betting with ace, right? It's not even a mix or anything. And we bet 3/4 pot here. Same logic, but we fold out queens, jacks. In this case, I guess we don't fold out like that much top pair, right? But the good thing is that we actually get a little bit more thin value, right, from hands like Jack 10 and 10-9 that are calling a little bit more often now, right? So that's just a neat little mechanic that I noticed, right? When there's a big gap between the top and the middle card, right? Middle pair is a really nice hand to bluff with. If you take away this gap, let's say this is king, queen, deuce-6, I really doubt we would be that interested in bluffing hands like ace, queen, right? Or at least the frequency is going to be much lower than before, right? Because it just doesn't have like the same kind of effect whereby you maybe get called. I guess you still get called by like some worse queen X, right? But the problem is that there's no pocket pairs below the king and the queen that are folding. So it really hurts the efficiency of this bet, right? So same thing, you know, if the board was something like ace, king, high, right? I really doubt that king, queen would be betting here, right? Maybe with the flush draw, we can still afford to bluff with this hand, right? But, you know, middle pair with no draw is pretty much a pure check at this point, right? So the bigger the gap, right? Ace 10 high, king 10 high, right? Even something like queen 10 high, I would imagine like middle pair should get bet pretty often. So let's return to this 7-5 deuce board. And I think earlier on I touched on the fact that when you bet a hand like 8s or 9s on the flop, it has a little bit of a bluff element, right, in the sense that UTG is supposed to fold a little bit of nines and tens. So this should also kind of tell you that if you bet these hands and you get called, right, there's no reason why you shouldn't continue bluffing on the turn, right? Which is not to say that you want to bluff the turn all the time. Obviously, that depends on like what exactly the turn is, but you should at least consider turning your hand into a bluff, right? And should at least understand that your hand no longer has that much showdown value. So let's say if the turn is at 3, right, it's actually, again, pretty interesting to see that 8s and 9s are now just pure bets. Right? And again, I wouldn't say it's a pure bluff, right? There's actually a little bit of a value element as well, because when you bet a hand like 3/4 pot, right, you are definitely folding out a lot of better hands, right? So this may or may not happen in practice, right? So important to keep that in mind and to know like who not to do this against, right? But in theory, our opponent is supposed to fold with a bunch of jacks and tens, and then he's actually calling us with some of these hands like pocket 6s and 5/6 or ace-5, that all of them have now picked up a straight draw. So it's quite a nice option to have with knights, right? Just to bet 3/4 pot on the turn, and then check back most of the rivers and take your showdown against hands like 5x and pocket 6s. Yep. So let's say if you think that your opponent is not turning these kinds of hands into a bluff, right? I would say the main adjustment is just to, on the one hand, you can see that it's more likely to not be bluffing enough, right? Especially on, I think the effect is maybe a little bit stronger on a high board, and because he's naturally going to be lacking bluffs in the first place. So if we go back to the previous ace-10 u6 board where we saw that hijack, and he's turning stuff like middle pair, pocket pairs into a bluff. If he's not bluffing these hands, it's quite difficult to imagine that he's going to be able to find enough bluffs, right? Because his range already interacts so well with the board, right? Even though he's bluffing like most of the king queen and king jack, he still needs to throw in a lot of these pocket pair hands to be balanced, right? So the most obvious exploit would just be to fold all of the hands that are indifferent, right? Especially against the sort of very big bet. You're getting like pretty poor products, so your opponent has to throw in even more bluffs to make you indifferent, and it's quite difficult to achieve if he doesn't realize that hands like king 10 need to be bluffing a lot of the time, right? So that would be the main adjustment, and I think it also does affect the types of bluff catchers that you prefer to defend with. So let's say this was a king 10 high board instead. So hijack here is going to be betting a little bit smaller. So technically, a lot of your 10x hands and your queens and jacks are all going to be indifferent, right? But the reason why they're indifferent is because your opponent is playing like this exact strategy where he's turning ace-10 into a kind of value bluff. So if he's not bluffing hands like ace-10, right, and then let's say he's increasing the frequency of some of the more natural bluffs like queen jack, right? Not that he has like that many of them, right? But let's say if he's somehow still able to achieve the appropriate value bluff ratio, right? It's just that his bluff selection lacks hands like second pair, right? I think this is also going to affect the kinds of hands that we prefer to call, right? Because part of the reason why we defend something like queens and jacks, right, part of the EV is coming from hands like ace-10 that will bet the turn and then check back the river. Right? If our opponent doesn't have a hand like ace-10 and his range is a little bit more like polarized, right, to very strong hands and pure bluffs, right, then for sure we would prefer defending hands like jack-10 over hands like queens and jacks, right? But I would say that's quite a minor point, right? The main thing to take away from this as a whole, right, is just to understand that if the board is high, especially if ranges are really tight, right, hijack versus UTG, it's pretty difficult for people to be finding enough bluffs, so you always want to err on the side of overfolding. Okay, so in conclusion, right, 3 main mistakes that tend to see a lot, right, are people betting too many weak overpairs. So we definitely want to favor betting the stronger ones in 3-bet pods when ranges are so tight, right, especially as if you're 3-betting versus early position. Early position is definitely going to have stuff like queens and jacks at some frequency. So quite a big equity difference whether you have aces or nines. Okay, second common mistake, betting too small on low boards. Right? So what you can do is bet a little bit bigger, right? If the board is rainbow, probably I would go for something like 2/3 pot, 2/3 to 3/4, right? And then for two-tone boards, especially the more connected ones, you need to be sizing down a little bit. Okay, and then finally, as ranges get tighter, right, the line between value and bluff tends to get blurred, right? Whether you're betting something like a middle pair, as whether it's a value bet, whether it's a bluff, it tends to not be so clear, right? But whatever the case is, we definitely need to bet more of these hands, at least in theory, or otherwise it's pretty difficult to find enough bluffs. And the way to exploit players who don't find enough of these bluffs, of course, is just to overfold. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys today. All right. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today, and I hope to see you guys in the next webinar.